On a misty summer evening, the shoreline of Ditch Plains Beach in New York yielded something that defied immediate explanation. Tangled in the surf line was a bloated, unrecognizable organic shape, a hairless quadruped with elongated limbs and a disturbing bird-like skull. It was July 12, 2008. Local resident Jenna Hewitt and 3 of her friends were simply looking for a place to sit on the sand when they stumbled upon the decaying carcass. Hewitt snapped a single photograph of the creature before they left the beach. That solitary image quickly escaped the confines of Montauk. By July 23rd, it appeared in a local newspaper. 6 days later, national blogs like Gawker and Jezebel republished the image under the headline, "Dead Monster Washes Ashore." Within 48 hours, the photograph was spreading across the globe. The sheer speed of early digital sharing took an isolated, ordinary walk on the beach and accelerated it into a massive, completely uncontrolled internet phenomenon. And so the legend of the Montauk Monster was born. Because there was only one widely circulated photograph, viewers were left with a massive information vacuum. Without context, scale, or a physical body to examine, public panic and wild speculation quickly rushed in to fill the void. The most prominent theory quickly capitalized on the local geography. People speculated the creature was an escaped biological mutant from the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, a highly secretive government research facility located just across the water from Montauk. Others argued it was a shell-less sea turtle, a theory based entirely on the creature's bizarre, beak-like facial structure. While a turtle's shell is actually fused directly to its spine and ribcage, making this biologically impossible, the visual of the beak was so striking it became a primary point of debate. What would you have thought if you stumbled across this on your local beach? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, make sure to like and subscribe to help us explore more historical and scientific oddities. This reaction highlights a specific pattern in human psychology. When confronted with an unrecognizable shape, the mind reaches for any familiar or culturally resonant explanation, whether it's a flawed biological comparison or a high-stakes conspiracy. While the internet speculated, zoologists approached the photograph as a set of identifiable anatomical coordinates. Experts began a systematic comparison of the carcass against known mammalian skeletal structures. They looked at the creature through the lens of marine decomposition. This is a destructive natural process where prolonged exposure to ocean water, scavengers, and friction distorts familiar anatomy until it becomes visually unrecognizable. Water immersion sloughs off the muzzle skin, exposing sharply tapered nasal bones that mimic a beak. Saltwater friction strips lip tissue, revealing prominent canine teeth. Finally, as muscle rots, joint structures collapse, stretching the front paws into humanoid fingers. The ocean acts as a mechanism that systematically dismantles the external features we use to identify animals, successfully tricking the eye into seeing a new species entirely. By isolating specific anatomical markers, the alignment of incisors and canines, the overall cranial architecture, and the visible claws, scientists cross-referenced the carcass with known local wildlife. The anatomical evidence pointed to a single, grounded conclusion. The terrifying beast of Ditch Plains was a heavily water-degraded common raccoon. Some skeptics maintained the whole thing was a viral marketing hoax made of latex. However, high-resolution analysis of the photograph revealed genuine bone structures that perfectly matched a raccoon's anatomy, ruling out a manufactured prop. Scientific analysis and anatomical framing provided the tools to identify the animal, grounding the anomaly in the reality of local biology. But before health officials or wildlife experts could recover the body for a definitive DNA test or autopsy, the carcass vanished from Ditch Plains Beach. Conflicting local rumors took hold immediately. Some residents claimed a neighbor took the carcass to his backyard to let it decompose into a skeleton. Others remained convinced that federal agents had quietly removed it under the cover of night to hide a failed experiment. Without a physical body to analyze, the scientific identification of the raccoon could never be verified through a DNA test. The tangible proof was gone, leaving only the photograph. That absence allowed the Montauk Monster to transition from a dead animal into modern internet folklore. It became a staple of cryptozoology, eventually being featured on television shows like Ancient Aliens and Jesse Ventura's Conspiracy Theory. The Montauk Monster shows how quickly a local discovery becomes a legend when physical evidence is removed. Without a body to provide a definitive answer, the story was free to evolve into whatever the public imagined it to be. The ocean has always washed strange things onto our shores, and as long as the tide keeps rolling in, the unknown will continue to fuel our stories. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more deep dives into the science of the strange. At 3 a.m., the Montauk coast is defined by a dense, heavy mist that rolls off the Atlantic and obscures the bluffs. To step onto the beach at this hour is to walk into a wall of silence. And for George Richardson, it's where his life simply stopped. George was a 50-year-old hospital executive and a father of 3. He was a scoutmaster and a community volunteer with no history of mental health struggles or financial secrets. In the eyes of everyone who knew him, he was the person least likely to ever just disappear. In August 2012, the family was staying at Hartman's Briny Breezes Motel. On their final night, at 1 a.m., George was seen awake in his room, telling his wife he might take a walk. When she woke up at 6 a.m., the bed was empty. George didn't take the tools required for a modern escape. His cell phone, his wallet, and his identification were all left behind in the room. He had walked out with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. We're going to look at the massive search that followed, but first, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the unexplained. The investigation was immediately hampered by a total absence of evidence. There was no struggle, no motive, and no digital footprint. Investigators were attempting to solve a case that had no starting point. The response was massive. Search and rescue teams, canine units, and state park police combed the dense brush along the highway, while the Coast Guard searched the Suff Line from Ditch Plains to Montauk Point. Detectives eventually noted that the gear the family brought to the beach was no longer complete. A baseball cap and a red bodyboard decorated with black and white stars were gone. The missing bodyboard changed the focus of the entire operation. Searchers moved their attention from the roadside bluffs to the open Atlantic. This pointed toward an accidental drowning. The currents off Montauk are famously powerful, with riptides that can pull even experienced swimmers into the deep water within minutes. However, the physics of a foam bodyboard make this difficult to reconcile. Foam is highly buoyant. In almost every drowning case involving surfing or bodyboarding, the board eventually washes ashore, even if the person does not. In George's case, the ocean returned nothing. This leads to the theory of a voluntary disappearance, the idea that George used the early morning hours to walk away from his life and start over somewhere else. But Montauk is a remote peninsula with a single main road out. To leave without a car, cash, or a phone, or triggering a surveillance camera in one of the most heavily patrolled summer destinations on Long Island is logistically improbable. Then there is the possibility of foul play. The old Montauk Highway is pitch black at 3 a.m., leaving a lone pedestrian vulnerable to a hit-and-run or an assault. Yet, the forensic evidence was non-existent. There were no skid marks, no blood, and no signs of a physical altercation found anywhere on the trails or the pavement. Every theory proposed to explain the disappearance is eventually dismantled by the physical facts. The logic of the investigation fails because the evidence required to support any single path simply isn't there. George Richardson's file remains open in the National Missing Persons Database. Over a decade later, the case hasn't progressed even a single step past that first morning in August. Montauk is a place of literal endings, where the solid ground of the island terminates into the infinite Atlantic. When the mist rolls in, the boundary between the land and the void feels porous. This is what's known as a liminal space, a threshold where the rules of the familiar world seem to drop away. We operate under the assumption that, in an era of constant surveillance and GPS, it is impossible to truly vanish. George Richardson's case challenges that sense of security. He left a sleeping family in a motel room, walked towards the surf, and never returned. All that remains is the image of a red bodyboard sitting at the edge of the water. If you have a theory about what happened that night, let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more cases that defy logic, subscribe to the channel. The legacy of George Richardson is the unsettling reminder that even today, a person can walk into the mist and simply cease to exist. On the extreme eastern tip of Long Island, winter storms blow thick fog across the bluffs of Ditch Plains, and if you walk through that mist at dusk, a massive steel silhouette slowly takes shape above the tree line. This is Camp Hero State Park. On the surface, it looks like a typical coastal hiking destination, but just off the trails, decaying concrete bunkers sit swallowed by the forest flora, hinting at a sprawling complex hidden right beneath the soil. The U.S. military originally staked its claim here in 1942. They built a sprawling coastal defense station designed to protect New York from naval attacks during the Second World War. To avoid detection from enemy aircraft, the Army deployed extreme camouflage. They disguised the entire installation as a quiet New England fishing village, complete with fake wooden church steeples and painted windows. Hidden beneath those quaint painted facades were massive 16-inch naval guns built on heavy iron mounts. These artillery pieces could fire armor-piercing shells at targets 25 miles out into the Atlantic. When an entire landscape is engineered for absolute secrecy, its sudden abandonment leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum quickly fills with rumors. Before we descend into what was actually left behind in those tunnels, hit subscribe and drop a comment below to help the channel grow. After the Second World War ended, the military didn't pack up. Instead, they upgraded Camp Hero into a SAGE radar site, specifically designed to track potential Soviet bomber fleets coming over the horizon. That upgrade required the construction of the AN/FPS-35 radar dish in 1960. It was an absolute behemoth, a colossal steel mesh sail measuring 120 feet wide and 40 feet tall, constantly rotating over the coastline. Pushing a radar signal that far out to sea required massive electromagnetic output. The pulses from the dish were so powerful, they frequently hijacked television and radio signals in the neighboring civilian town of Montauk. Then, in 1981, the military abruptly pulled the plug. They decommissioned the base, packed up their active equipment, and sealed the heavily reinforced footprint away from the public. You had decades of intense military secrecy, civilian electronics going haywire for years, and a massive locked-down facility abandoned overnight. It was the perfect incubator for localized paranoia. To understand why that paranoia took hold, we have to follow the footprint downward. If you slip past the rusted iron blast doors, the terrain drops into a network of pitch-black subterranean tunnels. Because this facility was built to survive direct naval bombardments and nuclear strikes, the multi-story command centers were encased in reinforced concrete walls up to 6 feet thick. The military didn't take everything with them in 1981. Over the decades, urban explorers squeezed into unsealed access points and documented the remains, finding abandoned generator rooms and flooded mess halls. Deep inside the dark, they found vintage 1970s office debris decaying in the humidity, surrounded by complex mid-century IBM equipment and dead instrument panels. Along the damp walls of these lightless corridors, explorers found cryptic graffiti left by previous trespassers. The most famous message, spray-painted in the dark, read simply, "Stranger, help me." The overwhelming claustrophobia, the heavy blast doors, and the rotting electronics created a highly credible physical backdrop. Anyone standing in those dark, damp rooms could easily believe something terrible had happened there. In 1992, an author named Preston Nichols published a book titled The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. He claimed that when the military officially left in 1981, rogue government agencies secretly moved in and took over the underground facilities. The book claimed rogue agencies used the radar dish's immense power to conduct fringe science, manipulating consciousness, abducting subjects, and attempting wormhole teleportation. But journalists, historians, and the military investigated and completely debunked these claims. The Montauk Project is pure science fiction. But the mythos was so pervasive and visually compelling that it eventually caught the attention of two aspiring television creators looking for a new project. The Duffer Brothers took the urban legend of Camp Hero, the sealed underground tunnels, and the mind control experiments, and pitched their hit series under the original working title, Montauk. There were no time-traveling monsters operating under Long Island, but the decaying concrete of Camp Hero absolutely served as the real-world blueprint for Hawkins National Laboratory and the fictional world of Stranger Things. While the science fiction lore is safe to enjoy from your couch, the state park itself is dealing with threats that are entirely grounded in reality. The 1940s-era concrete is actively decaying. Roofs inside the unlit underground chambers are crumbling, creating hidden drop-offs and a severe risk of structural collapse for anyone who steps inside. Decades of base operations also left behind serious environmental contamination. The state has had to fund extensive, costly cleanup efforts to remove industrial PCBs and heavy metals from the soil. And on the surface, harsh Atlantic storms are battering the shoreline. Rapid coastal erosion is violently tearing away the bluffs, continually exposing buried military cabling and massive structural footings to the open air. The site is actively hostile to human visitors today. The supernatural monsters of local lore have been replaced by the very real dangers of industrial decay and relentless natural forces. To manage this, New York State Parks officials continuously patrol the trail system. Whenever the eroding earth or a trespasser exposes a new entry point, crews move in immediately to weld heavy steel plates over the crumbling doorways. The strict rules to stay on marked trails are heavily enforced. They aren't trying to hide government secrets. They are just trying to keep hikers from plummeting into hazardous, collapsing ruins. The contrast here is incredibly stark. Down on the nearby Ditch Plains beach, surfers ride peaceful waves all afternoon, while a towering, silent steel dish stands watch directly above them on the bluffs. Camp Hero survives as a unique monument. It's a place where documented mid-century military paranoia decayed over decades, slowly settling into the foundation of modern American folklore. Thanks for watching. Check out the video on screen now for more on how history intersects with the present. Every summer, tens of thousands of visitors flock to Montauk, New York, famous for its world-class surfing and sprawling, picturesque coastal views. But step away from those crowded public beaches, and the landscape changes quickly. Just past the popular observation decks lies a hidden, unforgiving wilderness. The trails here are unpaved, and the ground is notoriously unstable. Without warning, the dense coastal brush gives way to severely eroded clay cliffs that drop 80 feet straight down into the Atlantic Ocean. This isolated stretch is part of Camp Hero State Park, defined by towering, abandoned military radar structures strictly off-limits to the public. You can be standing in a heavily trafficked tourist haven 1 minute and completely cut off from civilization the next. In June 2026, that stark geography became the setting for a baffling, unresolved tragedy. At 1:42 in the afternoon on June 11th, a group of hikers were navigating the trails near the Montauk Point East overlook. As they walked south along a narrow path, they noticed something tucked into the overgrown brush of the state parkland. They had stumbled upon the remains of a deceased individual. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived and locked down the area. The serene hiking trail instantly turned into an active, tightly controlled crime scene. By sunset, the same trails used by tourists hours earlier were under police guard. For a town that relies on the perception of total safety, the sight of forensic units at the East Overlook was a jarring disruption to the peak summer season. The initial 911 call from the hikers routed directly to the East Hampton Town Police, who sent the first officers to the Overlook. But investigators immediately hit a jurisdictional wall. Because the body was located completely inside the boundaries of Camp Hero State Park, local police lacked the authority to lead the case. The investigation was handed over to the New York State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation, Troop L, who assumed full control of the scene. Setting up a command post was incredibly difficult. Troopers hauled equipment through thick vegetation and cordoned off a sprawling network of unmapped, rugged trails. While fighting the treacherous footing and overgrown brush, forensic teams meticulously processed the area to secure whatever physical evidence remained on the cliffs. The strict legal boundaries of the park, overlapping with the unforgiving physical geography, severely slowed the crucial early hours of the investigation. The following day, on Friday, June 12th, State Police Public Information Officer Brittany Burton released an official statement identifying the deceased. It was a 35-year-old New York City resident named Lorin Bailik. Bailik was highly active online, operating a widely read Substack publication and an X account where she commented on artificial intelligence, venture capital, and social dynamics for tens of thousands of followers. She built a career deeply embedded in the fast-paced, hyper-connected digital world, yet met her end in an isolated, disconnected stretch of wilderness. With her tens of thousands of followers already analyzing her final posts, the investigation moved quickly from a local discovery to a case tracked by a national digital audience. Right now, the investigation is gridlocked by a few major unknowns. Authorities cannot yet say if this was a sudden medical event, an accidental fall from the slick clay cliffs, or a case of foul play. The state police are keeping all preliminary findings strictly under wraps, refusing to release details until they have absolute confirmation. This diagram maps exactly where the case is bottlenecked. The entire investigation, determining both the cause and manner of death, now hinges entirely on pending autopsy and toxicology reports from the Suffolk County Medical Examiner. Even with those reports still pending and the exact circumstances a mystery, law enforcement has officially assured residents and tourists that there is no ongoing threat to public safety. The trails at Camp Hero are once again open, but the geography that makes them scenic remains inherently dangerous. Until the medical examiner provides the missing pieces of Lorin Bailik's story, the mystery of the Bluffs continues. Share your theories below and subscribe for more as the case develops.